a Hindi proverb, jiski lathi uski bhains. James Mill was wielding the power. There was nobody to contest him. All that he wrote in the history of British India became first part of the British educational system, and later in 1852, when colleges and universities were created in India, became part of the curriculum here. The discourse that James Mill produced became institutionalized.
Right.
And began proliferating. The Britishers basically tinkered with our Varna-Jati system and created a very hierarchical system. Became a reality of the Indian people, and it continues to remain the reality of Indian people.
Namaste and welcome to Sangam Talks. Today we have a very interesting guest with us who's going to discuss his book Colonial Discourse and the Suffering of Indian American Children with us. We know that the colonizer devised numerous ways and means through which to convince the entire world and the colonizer that colonization was good for them. Because of colonization, the colonizer is now civilized, educated, and lives in the contemporary world at par with the rest of the world. However, we know that this isn't true. What colonization did was change the lens of the colonized, through which they looked at themselves and through which they looked at the rest of the world. What colonization did is breed a sense of inferiority, a feeling of being less than the rest of the world, a feeling that the West and Europe were better than their own cultures and civilizations. To expand on this thought and a deeper research, let us welcome Dr. Kundan Singh. Namaste, Dr. Kundan Singh. Welcome to Sangam Talks. Welcome to our studio. So, we are here to discuss your book, Colonial Discourse and the Suffering of Indian American Children. But we are discussing it in India. So, can you begin by telling us why you wrote this book and how is it relevant for Indian children as well?
Thank you, Dr. Wadhera, for yet another conversation. I believe we recorded one conversation about 5 years ago. That was just before COVID. At that point in time, I had written another book titled Making Children Hinduphobic. In a certain sense, you can say that this book is a continuation of that one. That book was written for a different reason. That was written to generate awareness amongst the parents of Indian American children with respect to the problematic representations that you have in US textbooks on India and Hinduism. That book was also semi-academic in nature. This one is thoroughly academic. And I worked on this book for 3.5 years in creating it. This is thoroughly academic, and it has been published by Palgrave Macmillan, which is an academic press. Now, the things that I wrote in that particular book in passing has been academically established in this particular book. So if you go through Making Children Hinduphobic, you'll find sections where I'm saying that there are certain representations that are Orientalist in nature, but I do not reveal how they are Orientalist in nature. This book goes into complete details with respect to the Orientalism which is involved. Now, given that Orientalism has become associated with Edward Said, he is not one of the thinkers that I have used in this particular book. I've used different ones. But let me come to this. How is this book relevant for India? How is it relevant for the distortion in Indian history? There are 6 chapters in this book. And chapters 3 and 4 specifically are relevant for Hinduism and India studies anywhere in the world. Because those two chapters go into the very foundations of the distortions that have happened. I've given many talks at Sangam and at various places that have been published by Sangam, where I'm talking about the distortion of Indian history by James Mill. Today I'm going to talk about the contents of chapter 3 in passing, because those materials are available on the website. The viewers can go into the links. What I am going to do is that I will talk about chapter 4, and it is chapter 4 that I have not spoken about widely, and this is where the novelty of this conversation will lie. So what is it that chapter 3 is talking about? Chapter 3 is talking about the 6 chapters that James Mill wrote in the history of British India, where he described the Hindu people as completely hierarchical and oppressive. And basically, because he is talking about the Hindu people, what has happened is that all the misrepresentations of his have become part of the ancient Indian history. He is talking about the social organization of the Hindu people, where he talks about the 5 well-known castes with which Hinduism has become conflated with: Brahmins, Kshatriyas, Vaishyas, Shudras and Chandalas. Next he comes to the representation of Hindu form of governance, which is represented in the current academic discourse under the canopy of ancient Indian history, where the Hindu form of governance or ancient Indian form of governance is described completely hierarchical and oppressive. There he talks about the Hindu taxation system or the ancient Indian taxation system, which is also described as oppressive. And then he talks about the manners and customs of the Hindu people, where he leaves no stone unturned to show the Hindu people as primitive, barbaric, uncivilized, uncouth, brute, and so on and so forth. And as I was telling you earlier, that these representations or misrepresentations have been spoken about quite extensively in my other conversations, and I'm not going to talk about those. What I'm going to talk about is that these representations are completely imaginary in orientation. So, if you would remember, I had also shared with you that James Mill never came to India. He wrote this book while sitting in London. James Mill is a very interesting figure in the sense that History of British India got published in 1817. And in 1819, he got hired as one of the officials of the East India Company. And very soon he started rising through the ranks. By the time it was 1823, he was second in command in the hierarchy of officials who were operating from the headquarters of the East India Company in London, India House. And by the time it was 1830, he became the chief. So in a certain sense, you can say that James Mill became the chief of the East India Company. Why do I say that he became the chief of the East India Company? This was because above him, you only had court of directors with a president who was a British parliamentarian. So this is the hierarchy in which James Mill began to operate. James Mill exerted enormous power over India till the time he was alive, and later as well through his writings of the history of British India. So the history of British India, published by James Mill in 1879, is not an ordinary book. It's a piece of work which has had very serious consequences for the future and the present of India. And this is something, on which I would want to emphasize. And for that, it is important to understand who James Mill was, what was he doing before he became an official with the East India Company, and what were his other activities for the domestic context of Britain. Once he was hired by the East India Company.
Okay. So can you tell us if he had a particular philosophy that he was following, or was he part of a group that were thinking about India? And since you say that he never came to India.
Right.
How was he writing about India? What was his frame of reference?
See, James Mill was born in 1773 in Scotland. He came from a very humble background. Now, incidentally, his mother had an aristocratic background. But his maternal grandfather had lost that aristocracy because he was involved in an uprising, in all probability in 1745, which goes by the name of Stuart Uprising. So, he lost his aristocracy, and his mother, of course, was familiar with that background. So she wanted to regain her aristocracy through her son, James Mill. The Mills, they had a business involving shoemaking and shoe selling. So while James Mill was growing up, his mother ensured that he did not become part of the family business.
Okay.
Now, interestingly, James Mill was a very precocious child. He was good in studies. So Mill's mother ensured that he remained focused on his studies and did not gravitate away from studies. His precocity was identified by local aristocrats who went by the name of stewards, and his education was funded by them. The lady aristocrat, Lady Stewart, was interested in making James Mill a preacher. James Mill finished his studies at University of Edinburgh in 1797. He tried looking for a job for another 5 years in Scotland itself, but he could not find a permanent job with any of the local parishes. So in 1802, he decided to come to London and try his hand in journalism. So after he moved to London in 1802, he started working for various journals and newspapers. It was around 1806 that he thought of writing the history of British India. James Mill was very ambitious. And in the foreword of this book itself, he writes that he wanted this book to be a governance manual for the East India Company officials. So he had a plan in mind right from the very beginning. Working for one of the newspapers, he was also manning the India desk. So, if you would walk down our memory lane, we would remember that the Asiatic Society in Kolkata was founded in 1784. So hordes of texts were getting translated by the Asiatic Society, and they were coming to Europe. And James Mill was writing reviews for some of those translations or productions. What he was finding was that all these different ideas were disparate in nature as far as India was concerned.
Okay.
So, if one went to all those writings, one could not really get a comprehensive understanding of India. So he wanted to work on a piece of work which gave a comprehensive understanding of India. That was, that was the other agenda that he had. So with these two agendas in mind, he began his work. And earlier he thought that by about, say, 1810, he would finish his work and he would, embark on other projects. Unfortunately, that did not happen because in 1808, he came across Bentham, Jeremy Bentham, who is known as the father of utilitarianism. Utilitarianism, or the utilitarian movement, has had a massive impact in Britain. And incidentally, we do not talk about either the movement or the transformations that the movement brought about in Britain. So with that said, let me give you a little bit of a background in Jeremy Bentham. Jeremy Bentham was, in all probability, about 35 years elder to James Mill. Unlike James Mill, Bentham had an aristocratic background, and he was educated at Oxford University, Queen's College to be precise. He was trained to become a lawyer. Quite similar to James Mill, he was not able to establish a successful legal career, because of which he turned to writing. Bentham was very sage-like and philosophical in orientation. Now, we need to understand the context in which the utilitarian movement grew and the writings of James Mill. Bentham.
Bentham.
The society in which Bentham was growing up, and even the society in which James Mill was embedded, was extremely hierarchical and oppressive. Power belonged to select few, and the masses were badly oppressed by these select few individuals, coming from monarchy, aristocracy, and clergy. The power, incidentally, was with aristocracy, because there was another uprising that had happened in 1688, in which the balance of power, between monarchy and aristocracy had moved towards aristocracy.
Okay.
Aristocracy also controlled clergy, through the purse. So what is the situation that you have in Britain? Very few individuals coming from monarchy, aristocracy, and clergy holding inordinate amount of power over the masses, which were living in extreme poverty and wretched conditions. This was the reality of 18th century Britain. Once again, something, which intellectuals in India do not talk about commonly. So, when James Mill began his writing career, he came across an axiom in a pamphlet, which became the war cry of the utilitarians: greatest good for the greatest number. Now, interestingly, this axiom is a direct translation of what you find in our texts, in our traditional texts: Bahujan Hitai, Bahujan Sukhai. So we must understand that by then the Europeans had already started translating our texts, and it is highly possible that this idea, had traveled to Europe through one of those translations which was picked up by Bentham. Bentham wrote quite profusely in 1780s. So earlier he thought, he was quite naive. He thought that he would produce all these materials and the society would change or get transformed. But but power does not work that way, right? So when James Mill came in contact with him in 1808, Bentham found a very ambitious disciple in James Mill. And James Mill had the capacity to basically simplify the ideas, the terse ideas of Bentham, and take them to the masses. He was already a journalist. He was writing for newspapers and journals. So what James Mill did was that he got massively involved in the utilitarian movement.
Okay.
What was the impact of the utilitarian movement? The utilitarian movement led to parliamentary reforms in 1832, which established democracy in Britain for the first time. Once again, something which people do not know about. People, when we talk about the Western world, we think that the Western world has had democracy since antiquity. That's not the case. So it was basically through this combination of Bentham and James Mill, in association with some other disciples that Bentham had, that these reforms came about.
Okay.
And in order for these reforms to come about, James Mill wrote quite profusely for the domestic context in Britain. So what happens is that you have two sets of writings as far as James Mill is concerned. One set of writings are there in the history of British India, and the other set is what he produced for the domestic context of Britain. Now, here is where you find that all that he has written on India is nothing but complete imagination. And this is what I have shown in chapter 4 of the book. So when James Mill is talking about the Hindu Brahmins, he's actually not talking about the Hindu Brahmins. He's talking about English clergy. The correspondences are stark, and I have shown these correspondences in this book.
Right.
When James Mill is talking about the Kshatriyas, he's not talking about, how Kshatriyas have behaved since antiquity within the Indian context. He's talking about, how the aristocrats have conducted themselves. When he's talking about the Vaishyas, he's talking about the British or European merchants, and when he's talking about the Shudras, he's talking about, the working class who were living in extreme poverty,
Right.
in England.
What I wanted to ask is, James Mill's ideas
Right.
were taken from the British society and projected onto the Indian society.
That's right.
But how come they had such a profound effect on the Indian system
Right.
that we are discussing this today?
Yeah. So, this is where the nexus of power and knowledge has to be looked into. When we talk about power and knowledge, and when we have to talk about this academically, we talk about Foucault, who has written quite a bit about this. But there's another way of discussing this, which is through a Hindi proverb, jiski lati uski bhais.
Okay.
Right? So James Mill was wielding the power, there was nobody to contest him. All that he wrote in the history of British India became first part of the British educational system, and later, after Wood's dispatch in 1852, when colleges and universities were created in India, became part of the curriculum here. So, there are a couple of things that are happening. One is that the discourse that James Mill produced became institutionalized
Right.
and began proliferating. And then, because the history of British India was a governance manual, policy decisions and policy implementations were made in India. So it's become very common knowledge that since 1880s caste census, were taken up in India by Risley, and and the Britishers basically tinkered with our Varna-Jati system and created a very hierarchical system. Now, this hierarchical system created by Risley and other British officials would not have been created if James Mill would not have created this discourse to begin with.
Right.
Which is a complete piece of imagination. So what is it that happened, Dr. Wadhera? And this is something that we really need to understand. What was a piece of complete imagination gradually became a reality of the Indian people, and it continues to remain the reality of Indian people. Because all the conversations in the mainstream that you are having on the issue of Varna and Jati are actually dictated by the discourse which James Mill created and institutionalized.
Right.
This is something which is extremely significant to understand. But see, you also need to understand that the story is quite complex. So once they had this characterization or this classification
In place.
they started tinkering with our society. And in all the provinces or states, that were in control by the Britishers, they started co-opting certain groups and began using them against other Jati groups in India.
Can you take up some examples?
Yes, I'll give you a couple of examples. I'll give you the example of the Iyer community from Tamil Nadu, and I will give you the example of Bhumiyar Brahmins from Bihar, the community to which I belong. So let me first talk to you about the Bhumiyars in Bihar. The Bhumiyar Brahmins in Bihar, not all of them, select families were made the zamindars under the zamindari system. And through this co-option, these families were made to unleash untold atrocities amongst other Bhumiyars, who were not co-opted or who were not willing to get co-opted, and other Jati groups in Bihar. The situation is such that even today, people do not take the names of some of those estates in the morning hours of the day. The second example is of the Iyer community. The Iyer Brahmins from Tamil Nadu are Smarta Brahmins. Do you know what Smarta Brahmins are?
Tell us.
The Smarta Brahmins are experts in smritis. The smritis, basically were social texts written for the social organization of the society and the social governance of the society. In a certain context, you can say that, there were constitutions, of pre-colonial Hindu societies. So these Marthas were basically the constitutional experts of their times. The Iyer Brahmins, once again, not all of them, but a substantial number of them, were co-opted by the Britishers not only to run their machinery in Tamil Nadu, but in entire India.
Okay.
And this is one of the primary reasons why the Iyer community in Tamil Nadu faced an extreme backlash. लेकिन वही जो कहते हैं कि चने के साथ घुन भी पिस जाता है. You know, not all Iyer Brahmins were, made themselves to get co-opted by the Britishers. But a substantial number of them did. And that was the reason till a certain point in time, till about 1980s, in post-colonial India, most civil servants, most ISs actually came from the Iyer community.
Okay.
Not from the Tambram community. Of course, I mean, the Iyers are Tambrams, but there is another community, which is the Iyengar community.
Yeah, yes.
The Iyengars were not involved in running
Just an academic question.
the British, machinery in India. Yes.
Just for my curiosity,
Yeah.
why weren't the Iyengars co-opted into this?
Because the Iyengars are not smartas.
Okay. Okay.
So generally, the Iyengars were involved in trading and and mercantile activities. I mean, they made a switch, but it was primarily the Iyers who were involved in running the show for the Britishers.
Okay.
And that is why, when you had these movements, in 1950s in Tamil Nadu, the Iyer community suffered a setback or a backlash. So, there is a certain nuance here and there's a certain complexity which unfortunately the intellectuals are not talking about. You have the left-leaning intellectuals who's, when they begin talking about Varna-Jati or caste, they say that, that we have had an oppressive system within Hinduism since antiquity, which is completely not true. And then, you have right-leaning so-called intellectuals, who want to completely deny this.
Both of which are wrong.
Both of which are wrong. Because what is it that happened? In this interim, there was a piece of imagination.
That was at play.
That was at play. That was that got concocted, by James Mill, which was made into a reality. The system, which was very amorphous and loose, and definitely not hierarchical and oppressive, was made into an hierarchical and oppressive system where certain communities had the privilege and others
Did not.
were suppressed. So James Mill's writings basically created the same conditions in colonial India in which he, along with Bentham, had found himself.
So basically, he was writing about the British society and projecting it onto the Indian society.
And not only that, because of the power that he wielded on Indian society, what he eventually did was that he funneled the entire chunk of the British society, into the Indian society.
Okay.
The Indian society, which was created during the colonial times, and what you see in post-colonial times at this point in time, is the creation of the British officials, and this is something that we need to thoroughly understand. And for that, this book is just the beginning. Because what has happened, Dr. Wadhera, is that during the colonial times, there was not just a transfer of wealth, there was a transfer of civilization. The ideas that were flowing from here to Europe were captured by the British intellectuals, which led to their transformation, the transformation of their society, and all that existed, in their society, including their bureaucracy and their judiciary, was pushed onto us. And those systems are intact even today. But in order to dismantle all this, what is required is thorough research and a thorough expose of what really has transpired, in the colonial times.
Correct.
And how our society was shaped through this colossal imagination of James Mill. I would like to say that it is not only the society, which was tinkered with. The bureaucracy that they established, the judiciary that they established, the policing that they established, is based on the imagination of James Mill. And as an axiom, what we can take is that whatever the utilitarians were transforming in their domestic context, they were pushing them into India. It's something very similar to what corporations are doing now. All the products that they're phasing out in the so-called first world, they sort of push them into Indian markets. So what you see with products at this point in time happened with respect to ideas during the colonial times.
Okay.
And this requires, serious research and serious expose. And certainly it does not require people, who just want to make quick name and fame, based on certain ideas. The original texts will have to be looked into. For writing this book, I went into everything, almost everything, which has been written on James Mill and by James Mill, both for the Indian as well as the British context.
Thank you for telling us all this, Dr. Singh, and thank you for revealing such startling truths and nuances of the colonial discourse to us. And I hope this will be a series of conversations in which we'll focus on the topics and ideas you just discussed.
Sure.
Thank you for today. Namaste.
Namaste. I just want to add that this book is available open access. On the website of Paul Grave Macmillan. Paul Grave Macmillan is part of Springer. So all the people who are interested in this research can go to the website of Springer, look up Colonial Discourse and the Suffering of Indian American Children. The entire book can be downloaded and they can read the book for free. So thank you very much for inviting me and for this conversation.